speaking specifically of the Old Testament law, says, "You've heard it said, but I tell you." And once again, we're challenged with thinking whether or not Jesus was rewriting the law. Was he pushing the Old Testament to the side? My wife was speaking with the teacher at our school that our kids go to, in Kidron, Central Christian, and she was speaking with the Bible teacher here this past week. And in a very real way and transparent way, she just said to her, this is the Bible teacher speaking to Kristen, she just said, "I'm reading through the Old Testament right now, and I am just grappling with that God that I know is God and our God today, and how he chose to speak and act, right, within the world and his chosen people, and Jesus." And I find that as we walk through this Sermon on the Mount, that this morning once again has us, I wouldn't say in conflict, but maybe you're going to feel that in your spirit this morning. I would say this: the conflict that you may experience this morning or in your walk through what Jesus wants you to do in this area of your life is never a conflict between a God that is hypocritical or can't make up his mind, but it's a conflict of his holiness and your depraved heart. See, it is us who need to have the revelation of the Spirit to show us a God who was holy before the foundations of the world, is today as he sustains us in all things, and forevermore will be. So this text this morning speaks deeply in my own heart and spirit. I continue to say this to you. I said it last week as we walked through what Jesus spoke to us in our words and the oaths that we choose to say, and being trustworthy people who follow a king that is other than this world, right? And as Jesus spoke to us earlier on about not being those who divide, and even in the midst of our marriages and divorce, not being those who covet and have adulterous hearts within the lust of the world, and those who are angry in our hearts against brother and sister, or else that is murderous in our very spirits, because he has called us to be salt and light. And be it not that we lose our saltiness this morning, we look into what these words truly mean in retaliation. And so, let's bow our hearts and heads one more time and just ask the Lord to be with us. Father, what we know not, teach us. What we are not, make us. And what we have not, give us. For the sake of your glory. It's in Jesus' name I pray this. Amen. So Jesus starts off with words of, "You have heard it said," right? Well, what is it that they had heard said? Well, as you see right there in verse 38, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Well, where is this coming out of? Where do we see this law that he is leaning upon and reminding them of? Well, one of those spaces and places would be in the book of Exodus. Genesis and Exodus. Exodus chapter 21, you can mark it down, write it down, or even turn there. Exodus chapter 21, and specifically verses 23 through 25. Now, what happened just in Exodus 20? What just took place? The Ten Commandments. Thank you. The Ten Commandments had just been given. God had called his people, And don't forget, if you look into the Jewish people that were called of God to be his people, it never was that he was exclusive with a single soul group of people that were only to be saved, if you will, right, from the world. It's that he was and had been calling a group of people to be his prophets and priests and ministers of his salvation. And in fact, before the fall, he had called Adam and Eve themselves to do this very thing in their marriage covenant, as it were, to be fruitful and multiply, to pursue the earth, to subdue it, right? To tend it. And he had done each of these things to Adam and Eve, and of course to Noah in the call of the same light. And now he is calling through Abraham a group of people that he wants to show his heart to the world of redemption. And in doing so, he lays out the law. And we all know, or many of us know, the context of the Ten Commandments that were given, even in the midst of an adulterous, heart of the people and the golden calf. And those first tablets are broken, and God gives them again. And now he is laying out the laws, literally, of the land. Verse 23, he speaks and says this: "But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life." This is in the context of two men that hit a pregnant woman, and if the child lived, then it would be okay. But if the child itself had died, he says, there shall pay life for life. Verse 24, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And of course, he continues on in those ways, but this is the crux of what Jesus speaks as the law given. Just a few other verses that you could write down, or passages, I should say, that mention these things. Leviticus 24 also speaks of this, in 17 through 23. Whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make good life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor as he has done, it shall be done to him. And then he goes through the same list there in Leviticus of fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Deuteronomy 19 speaks the same thing. Deuteronomy 19 verses 18 through 21. It says that if the judge inquires diligently and there's a witness who claims something about someone else and it's a false witness, so he's accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him, right, what he meant to do to his brother. And so you shall purge the evil from your midst. And so for just a moment, we need to sit here and look at what this law intended and what it did not. You see, the Deuteronomy passage there speaks the purposefulness of this. And once again, we think of a holy and loving God, and we think about what was being done, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. What is happening here? Is this vengeance? Is this something that God is, retributively doing to people that have done wrong? Because many of us have that view sometimes of God who is just waiting for a mistake to be made so that therefore he can condemn and punish. No, the Deuteronomy passage speaks very much there that he is giving the law so that something can be done. And that thing is that sin, evil, would be purged from their midst. And this is a very overarching, statement this morning, but a truth in the economy of God is that sin does not go unanswered. Sin does not go unanswered. And you're going to need to think that through when we reach the other words Jesus then speaks to us today about forgiveness, because that's where we're heading. But in the midst of the law first, there's an interesting thing. One, it was to purge sin from the camp, from the people of God. It was actually a pursuit for holiness, that there be judgment and consequence to sin. Of course, parents, we know this in certain ways with our children, that if they do something wrong, they need to know it and feel it, right? Feel it. And even in the midst of our judgment as parents, because we're imperfect, right? Fallible and not always right in how we choose this consequence, because oftentimes we work this out of anger in our own hearts. So there's already a battle in our own spirits that the Lord has to, right, succumb and take over as we show our children these decisions have consequences. Because it's the child who gets to make any decision that they want and never sees a consequence, right, that we might reference as spoiled or a brat, or they've given what they want and they ask for it and it's done, and they have a very skewed perspective, not only of the world, but I would argue they have a very skewed perspective of the God we're calling them to serve. So God is seeking holiness in the law. And of course, we know what this is, because the law itself is the holiness of God. It reveals something to humanity, does it not? It shows us our sin. So the law also was not just revealing sin and showing the holiness of God, but the law was also protecting someone. And this is something we don't often see in the judgment that God passes. The law was actually protecting the one who had committed the sin. The law was saying to the one who falsely, right, accused his brother, listen, he gave false witness, and so do exactly to him what he was hoping to do to his brother. An eye for an eye, no more. Tooth for a tooth, a foot for a foot, it just, right, goes down through. And you get into these passages of Leviticus, and it's, if there's an oxen and it falls in the wayside and it dies, then you must get that oxen or get another one to pay back to your neighbor. And we start getting into all of these, right, rules and regulations of what the law is attempting to do. But one thing it is actually doing is protecting the one who has committed the offense. Why, then, would they have to be protected? See, there lies the question. Why would the one who commits an offense need to be protected, and from whom? Well, the answer ultimately is from us, from the one who was hurt, from the brother who was falsely accused. And why is that? Well, we just look into the rabbinic traditions before we look into our own hearts, where we always can start with the Pharisees. That's always an easy way to go, right? We can look at them before we really want to begin to look at our own hearts. See, the rabbinic tradition allowed each and every man to become his own judge and jury. See, what had taken place is that there was mandates given where personal vengeance, right, it usurped God's law and allowed someone to not only give a penalty, but they would give the penalty and then some. Because, we really need to teach them, right? We really need to show them. I mean, they sinned, but they really need to be punished. See, the problem with the Pharisaical heart and the problem with the human heart and the problem with our hearts is that we don't just want the same wrong done, we want more to be done. The human heart is vengeful. We want to see people pay for their sin. Now, how do I know this? Without driving with you in the car, without living your life, without seeing your parenting, grandparenting, without seeing you in your coworker relationships, without seeing you in some of the situations you've had to endure in your life, which we'll talk about some of those in a moment. I know this a little bit because look at what movies are put on display